Okay, is that picking
Yeah,
up?
so
Picking up
my
all right?
name is Jordy Izzard, and I'm a SAIS Alumni Relations Officer, and today's date is May 10th, 2012, and I'm here conducting an oral history interview with Wingate Lloyd, who is one of our graduates from the SAIS Washington, D.C. class of 1955, and we're so appreciative of your time, and thanks for being here.
Well, thank you, Jordy. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah,
and
why
I'm
don't
happy
we...
to help on this very interesting project.
Yeah, it's really great. And why don't we just start with kind of what originally brought you to SAIS?
Well, I think more than anything, I was investigating career alternatives, and the autumn that I came to SAIS in 1953, I had taken the Foreign Service exam. So I didn't know whether I was going to pass or not, but if I didn't pass, I was going to do something else. If I did pass, I might go in the Foreign Service. I did pass, and I learned in January, I guess it was, that I'd passed. And so the 2 years at SAIS were really preparatory to the Foreign Service, although I knew very little about the State Department. And the people who were teaching at SAIS really were not trying to train Foreign Service officers. They were teaching us about politics and economics and history and that sort of thing. This was a period in SAIS's history when some people were getting degrees in 1 year, or some in 1.5, and some in 2. And I sort of finished in 1.5 years and stayed on for the end of the last semester in the spring of 1955. I took courses with William Phillips, with Dean Thayer, with Grove Haynes, with Paul Linebarger, and 2 or 3 other towering figures in SAIS's history, Majid Kaduri, and others. I learned a lot. I learned a lot at SAIS. You know, one learns in spurts if you look back in your education, and SAIS was one of those spurts, I think, that Bill Phillips had an extraordinary way of saying to a group of puzzled students as they were confronting an economic issue, it's a piece of cake. You can really understand it. As opposed to the professor who says, I've spent 40 years learning how to do this, it'll be really tough for you. Phillips said, it'll be easy. And that immediately relaxes the student, and I think the student does better. So,
what are your other memories of being at SAIS?
well, it was at Florida Avenue. I lived upstairs. I lived on the second floor, I guess it was, on the third floor rather, sharing a room with another guy in a double-decker bunk. We had probably 20 students on that floor and 20 more above, and we had the usual activities. The dean was very much involved in student activities. Priscilla Mason, of course, was there. The professors that I remember the best are the ones that I've mentioned, and when I talk about Rangoon, I'll talk about Bill Phillips in greater detail. But I think that it was a great atmosphere, and it was very cooperative, and a lot of, in some cases, lifelong friendships were made there. I think we were, by and large, some had been in the military, some were coming out of the Korean War service, and some were not. There was kind of a line between them. I had not been in the military, but I think most had not. But there were 3 or 4 or 5 who had. The accommodations were pretty Spartan. The classrooms were pretty Spartan. The learning process was sort of the classical process of read the book and listen to the lecture, and there'll be an exam on Wednesday. I enjoyed it. I thought it was very stimulating. I learned a lot. And there were professors who I've never forgotten. During my second year, the idea of overseas outposts for SAIS was broached. I mean, when you introduced me, you said I was in the SAIS Washington class of 1955. Well, of course, that wouldn't have come up before that because there was only one SAIS class.
Right.
So, and only in the second year, 54-55, the idea of Bologna was opened. I guess Bologna was opened in 54. Grove Haynes went to Bologna maybe in '55. I don't exactly remember the date. Phillips went to Rangoon in '54, '55. And this was a new idea. This is not a big idea today. Many universities throughout the country have overseas activities, many not degree-granting branches the way SAIS has, but they at least allow courses or provide courses overseas. I think that really, we had the usual social activities. We had a story by Dean Thayer that I'll tell you. I was sitting beside him there's a picture in that book called The History of SAIS in a Burmese gambang, which is a pink sort of hat with a bow off to the side. And he told a story about, I guess we got on the subject of deans. What does a dean do? How do you hire a dean? He said, well, let me tell you a story, Lloyd. There was a story about a guy who was in Washington State who was invited to become dean at a college or a school in the eastern part of the United States, and he tried to take a train, and the train was snowed in, and he tried to get a car, and the car broke down, and he was several days late when he arrived for the interview. And when he came into the interview room, they said, well, I'm terribly sorry, but I just, the job's been filled. We didn't think you would show up. And the guy said, well, I'll be a son of a bitch. And he said, oh, well, we'll make you dean after all. So that was the job of the dean. And this was from Philip Thayer. I think that the idea of an overseas commitment by SAIS was indeed new. And the first people to go were Gene Reese and David Fanner and Joe Fisher. And they went in the spring and summer of '54, I think. I went in the late spring of '55, and we were 4 students in Rangoon. Life in Rangoon was very primitive indeed. There was no hot water, no air conditioning for any of us. I was at that point married, lived in the downstairs of a house that was owned by a Chinese family. Bill Phillips ran the center, which consisted of a library and a series of seminars that he ran and we assisted. We 4 sort of postgraduate students assisted in. Mainly on Southeast Asia, commodity policy in Southeast Asia, the International Tin Agreement, coffee agreements, that kind of thing. The courses were, of course, conducted in English, and by and large, the Burmese students were pretty good in English, but they were not totally at home. They didn't speak English all day long, so their written English was not terribly good. We ran a conference on Southeast Asia in, I guess, the late fall of 1955. And maybe it was the mint julep story that you heard from Gene Reese, but I do remember that one of the speakers, we didn't have any ice for the cocktail party because you couldn't buy ice. So the martinis were, in order to cool them, were simply put in bottles in the freezer. So they were nice and cold, but they were not diluted as most people were accustomed to taking their drinks. And our lead speaker the next day had about 4 of those and decided to take a nap. And I think Gene and I and some other people took him off and put him to bed that night. You may have already heard that from Gene. But the conference, there was a book published on it. This was 1955. This was the France's problems. It was after Dien Bien Phu. France's problems in Southeast Asia were mounting, but it was before the Tonkin Gulf. It was before America became involved. So we were looking at Southeast Asia very much from an arm's length point of view. We had professors from the University of Malaysia in Kuala Lumpur, from the University of Singapore, who came there and gave speeches and ran seminars over a period of a couple of days at this conference. And that was really about it. I left Rangoon, and as I left Rangoon, the university was closed because of student riots, as you know from the history of Burma. The student union was the stepping stone for young rabble-rousers. Those in power had come up that way, and they knew it. So when the university got out of hand, they closed it, and they closed it sometime in '55. It was sort of winding down, I think, when we left. Johnstone was the name of the professor who succeeded Bill Phillips there. He had been at SAIS for 5 or 7 years before that.
And tell us when you left Rangoon and you graduated from SAIS.
Yeah, I had graduated before I went to Rangoon.
Okay,
Yeah.
so then you went for about a year.
Yeah.
And then tell us about your career after that.
Yeah, well, I went in the Foreign Service. Things were slow in the 50s. There were budgets were tight. There was very little Foreign Service officer intake in the junior classes, and I went into the Foreign Service. I came back in '56 and went into the Foreign Service in early '57. After a tour in Washington, I went to France. And then to Cameroon. I went to France, where I was an economic commercial officer, and spent a lot of time learning French, which became very useful. I then went to Cameroon, where I opened a new consulate in Douala, Cameroon, on the seacoast, and learned a lot about African politics and the business of doing business in Africa. And then I went to Morocco for 3.5 years, and came back to the U.S.
Were you in Casablanca?
I was in Rabat.
Okay.
I was a political officer in the embassy in Rabat. And we were looking at what makes Morocco tick as political officers. We were also trying to continue the relationship with the Voice of America, where we had broadcast facilities where we broadcasted into the Ukraine and the USSR. That northeastern slant from Morocco toward Moscow was particularly propitious for getting the word into the Soviet Union behind the bloc. So we had huge antenna fields in various places in Morocco, and these were the years during the period of the independence of the Arab world after the revolution in Cairo, and it was difficult for Morocco to be too pro-Western, but and so we tried to keep them as close as we could. We were competing with the French, which had always considered Morocco to be their private hunting ground, and who resented American intrusion into Morocco from the standpoint of policy and from the standpoint of economic assistance. After Morocco, I went back to Washington. I worked I was the Morocco desk officer for a couple of years, and then worked in the Secretariat with Secretary Rogers, and then went to Portugal as the political counselor in the embassy there. Our concern in Portugal was primarily dealing with a country in the last throes of decolonization, and with the revolution coming, which finally took place in 1974. The remainder of my career in the Foreign Service, I was in the Foreign Service 25 years, was involved in principally in 2 countries, I guess, in Canada, where I worked on Canada, based in Washington. I was Director of Canadian Affairs. I worked on Canada for 4 years, and then on Egypt. I was Director of Egyptian Affairs in 1982-83.
Were you in Egypt?
I was in Washington.
I see. Okay.
We had an 8-person office in the State Department, which backed up the embassy and was in touch with all the agencies in the U.S. government who were represented at the embassy in Cairo. I spent a lot of time traveling to Cairo and to Alexandria, but I didn't actually live there. I left the Foreign Service in 1983. I took a job with ITT Corporation and worked for them for another 25 years. The job was called Director of International Relations. I was originally a political risk analyst in the days in the 80s where they thought political risk was a key that would unlock unknowns of the future. I think the fall of the Shah and our problems with Iran brought people to think that, oh, if we'd only had political risk analysis, we would have understood better what was going on in those countries. Well, this same process has been going on for millennia, so it's not new. At ITT, I was doing political risk analysis, and that sort of migrated into export licensing control, a huge company spread over 100 countries, dealing with all sorts of American rules on U.S.-owned corporations. And I retired from ITT, left my work for ITT in 2008. Mm-hmm.
So you worked there for over 20 years.
I worked there for over 20 years, yeah.
That's
it was interesting. It was interesting to be on the other side of the table, just as you and I are on each side of the table today. I had been on the government side, and I have one very poignant recollection of when I was director of Egyptian affairs. We had a major New York bank that had problems in Cairo, and it was a very complex issue, and they wanted the help of the State Department. And these three people in their three-piece suits came in to see me, and I looked at at what they put on the table, and they didn't have anything for me. They didn't have a piece of paper explaining their problem. And I said to myself, you know, on a very busy day, I've given you an hour of my time, and now I'm going to have to take notes, and then I'm going to have to dictate a memorandum, and I'm going to have to send it to the Commerce Department and to the U.S. Embassy in Cairo, asking that they try and deal with your problem. Well, I took that to heart, and when I was on the other side of the table, I always came with a piece of paper. And when a person would take out their pencil and paper and begin to take notes as I made my presentation about how we would like to sell something, or how we would like your intervention with the government of Pakistan or Singapore or whatever it might be, I'd say, put your pencil away, I've got all this written down, I'm going to give it to you. And all they had to do was to get my card and the piece of paper, and they could send the piece of paper to the post overseas, which is a much more efficient way of doing business.
A little briefing. Yeah.
One sort of postscript from the career point of view, I taught at Georgetown in the School of Foreign Service for 10 years. Mm-hmm. Teaching second-year graduate students, much the same sort of students who were at SAIS, people who had, like SAIS students, worked for 2 or 3 or maybe more years, and were looking to improve their credentials and become more employable. Mm-hmm. Although it was not it was no more than SAIS is a place to find a job, but I got some insights there on the importance of some aspects of academic affairs, and the main one is learning how to write. Mm-hmm. We've talked about keeping your options open. Well, that's certainly true. I mean, all options are open. I think for somebody in their 20s looking for a job, too many options are open. You're told, oh, you're good at this, you're good at that, you can do anything you want. No, but I just like to have a job. I just like to get started. And so I think that having them look broadly at a whole lot of things.
And now you're giving advice to our current students today.
Yeah. Right. Maybe that is not, I think what they need to be able to do is to look at it from the employer's point of view. You're coming in to talk to a vice president of a company or to a dean of an academic institution. What can you do? Where will I fit you in? Having been a foreign service officer and speaking to a major U.S. corporation, they didn't have any foreign service officers. They didn't have any slots for foreign service officers. They didn't know what we did. So try and make yourself fit into a category that's understandable to the dean of the university who might hire you, or to the corporate executive who might hire you. Are you going to go in the legal department? Would you be in public relations? Would you be in sales, in marketing? What would you be best at? Mm-hmm. So I think the more you can learn, the more a student can learn about about corporate life, the better, and not dismiss it as being non-academic, non-cerebral, and something that perhaps is beneath the level of a newly minted SAIS graduate.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be a
Mm-hmm.
word of advice, because it's the other guy has a. I remember being told this. The hiring person has a problem too.
Mm-hmm.
He's got an empty chair outside his office. He needs to fill it. If he doesn't fill it soon, he's going to lose that chair. Somebody else is going to take that chair away.
And he has the challenge of needing to find the right person to
And
sit
he
in
needs to
it.
find the right person, and that soon.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Terrific.
So, and I think that to echo something you said, Jordy, earlier, the degree teaches you how to do things rather than teaches you the specifics. And I felt that very much both when I was at SAIS and when I was teaching at Georgetown. There's not going to be an exam on the 30 Years' War. We're not going to start with the beginning and the end. But you're as a SAIS graduate, you're not going to have all the facts. You don't know everything. You're going to be looking at a situation and you don't have all the facts. And if you wait, you're not going to be able to act. It's not like studying the 30 Years' War where all the facts are there. You just have to dig it out. This is something you're going to have to act before the facts are all clear to you.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much,
there you are.
Wingate. It was a pleasure to have you, and we hope you have
Well,
a
good
great
luck to you.
day, and thanks for all you've done for SAIS and the world. And
Great.
have a wonderful day.
Great project, I think.